today to do my book of the month, spoiler-free kind of review, and then spoiler-filled book club-based questions and spoiler chat. And this month's book was Work Like Any Other by Virginia Reeves. I got this book from my Blind Date with a Book subscription. I really enjoyed the service. I'd recommend it for anybody who isn't super picky about what they read and wants just kind of some interesting and new books to be introduced into your repertoire. This book specifically, Work Like Any Other, is a historical fiction novel that touches on this man's life, Roscoe Martin, in Alabama in the 1920s. You go between two different points of view with him, one of which is on his wife's family farm as Alabama rural communities are beginning to get electricity. The points of view kind of deal with something that happened because of electricity being introduced to the farm by Roscoe before the power company wasn't actually legally introducing it. And it's kind of the fallout of that and Roscoe's point of view about it. And it was just a really interesting read. And that's all I really have to say for summary. So I'll move on to my likes and dislikes. I'll start with my 3 likes first. The first like is the opposing point of views between Roscoe and Marie. I found it did a really good job giving you an idea of the setting and the relationships. My second like is again related to point of views, but this time in terms of how they flowed together with how they were written. Sometimes I find point of view switches either between people or timelines can be very abrupt, but these were written very well and the storytelling was very cyclical. So every time you had a change of time or person, it was a very natural flow into the other point of view, which leads me to my third like, how cyclical the story was. No matter what point of view, you knew where you were in the story and you knew how it related back to the part you just came from, and it just resulted in a really well-rounded story. There weren't any surprises in terms of plot twists or anything, but that is not a negative. It had a story to tell. It had a story to tell across multiple timelines, and they all circled back and ended in the same spot, which I really enjoyed. It gave a good sense of satisfaction to the storytelling. And now I'll move on to my negatives. The first negative is that the pacing was kind of odd. Although the changes in perspective and timeline did do a lot to maintaining kind of the freshness of the story, there were parts that dragged quite a bit. I found that it happened a lot when you were looking at Roscoe's point of view from the past. I just didn't find it quite as interesting, and so for me, it dragged, and I found the pacing of the book was thrown off because of it. My second negative is the general kind of lack of information you got, and I know it's because you were only getting information from one point of view at a time, but there were certain things where you only got Marie's information on it, and it would have been great to get a little bit more of a more fleshed out information from it. Like, my specific example is in court, which is pretty early on in the book, and there's just something about Roscoe's point of view that while you get a very good internal picture of him, you don't get as much information about the world around him as you do with Marie's point of view. And that just overall didn't give me as much meat as I would have liked with the story. And my third negative is a very, very minor one, and it was the ending. Even though I felt like the storytelling itself was really satisfactory in terms of how cyclical it was and how everything related back to each other and how you always knew where you were in the story, but the ending felt very anticlimactic, I guess. And the only reason I say that is because I finished and I was like, oh, I'm done. It felt very strange not to have more definite resolution. I appreciated where it cut off for the story. It felt a little bit odd and like there should have been a little bit more to it. It's not a bad ending. It's not an amazing ending. It's just kind of an annoying ending, and it ended up being a minor dislike for me because of that. And now I'll move on to the characters. I'm really just going to talk about Roscoe here, as he's kind of the main one who you spend the most time with. I actually really enjoyed being in his head. You got a really good picture of his growth because of the internal monologues, and you got a lot of internal contemplation about what had happened to him up to that point, the point you're following him. And I really loved the way his growth was so internal. I also really enjoyed the difference between the two timelines of his point of view. You have the past Roscoe and present day Roscoe, and they are very different people, and I really enjoyed the contrast because it emphasized how much he had grown by the end of the novel. And as I've said a couple times now, he grew, and I really enjoyed that. There was a lot of character development with him over the course of the novel, and why wouldn't there be? This was a really traumatic and long drawn out event for him, so it really makes sense that it had such a big impact. I also really enjoyed the side characters that you got to see. None of them were super dynamic or crazy interesting, but they all had added these little bits of flavor to Roscoe's story and did a really good job of keeping the plot interesting as you went forward. With that, I'm done with my characters. I'm going to move on to kind of my wrap up for the spoiler-free portion of this. I'm going to give you a rating, quick summary of the review, and then I will give you another warning before heading into the spoiler portion. So for me overall, I really enjoyed this book as a whole. I especially liked the way the point of views set the scene, set the relationships, and just linked up and flowed so naturally, giving a very good, smooth feeling to the story. The main character with Roscoe did a lot of growth, which I always really like. I do enjoy good character work. And overall, the setting was just really well described. I had a very good idea of what each situation was like, what it looked like, and the general kind of tone and atmosphere to it as well. The writing was quite well done in this book. I would give this book a 4 out of 5. I really would recommend this to anybody who enjoys historical fiction, especially when there's a distinct family bend to the narrative. That's all I really got to say. So I will move forward, and again, this is your final warning. Everything after this will be spoiler filled. I'm doing book club questions, I'm doing a spoiler chat about a few things I want to talk about, and that's it. So click off now if you do not want to hear any spoilers. All right, so first up is my 6 book club questions. The first one is, what was your initial reaction to the story? And for me, my initial reaction was interest, I guess. The setting and the general relationship was set pretty quickly in the first couple pages. So I was really intrigued how the story was going to develop with those characters. 2, what is your favorite chapter or scene? And in this book, I actually didn't have a favorite chapter or scene. None of them were absolutely amazing, but I enjoyed the book as a whole overall much more than I typically enjoy books as a whole. 3rd one was, how did the characters change throughout the book? The biggest change for the main characters was with Roscoe, because so much of the book was from his point of view. You could say he was the main character almost uncontestedly, and he had a lot of growth because he had to develop and change his ways, specifically after the accident that killed someone on the illegal lines he was running from the Alabama Power Company. And the thing I liked with this was there was a lot of internal contemplation that led to the changes, so it felt very realistic. Question 4, how did you feel about the ending? As I mentioned in my dislikes, it was very surprising to me at how abruptly it was kind of cut off, and I was very surprised when I got to the end. It was kind of like, oh, it's done. I thought I could have had more immersion in this world. Question 5, would you read another book by this author? And I said, maybe? I really don't know. It depends on the content. If it's a similar topic to this, probably, but otherwise I really can't say without looking at it, because I know part of what made me like this book so much was the setting, and if that isn't consistent, I don't know that I would pick it up. And then my 6th and final book club question, does this book remind you of any other books? For me personally, it doesn't. However, if you guys have any suggestions, feel free to comment down below and let me know if there's anything that you think that sounds similar to this that you've read that you think I'd enjoy. And with that, I am done the book club questions. And I'll just move on to my spoiler chat here now. There's really just a couple things I wanted to talk about, the big one being, and I'm sure my high school English teachers are very proud of me for this, channeling my inner, writing critic, because the thing I really enjoyed the most about this book was the state of the farm and the house and how it mirrored the progress of Marie and Roscoe's marriage. Because in the beginning, they talk about how run down and like neglected it is. And then after Roscoe brings power in, the farm starts to flourish a little bit. Like, and the superficial things are changed. So they get the house looking nice, but like the farm still isn't like good. And you know that the flourishing it's going through is kind of like fake because it's strictly from the power that Roscoe's siphoning off illegally. And then you get into the final stage where after Marie and Roscoe divorce and the farm is given to the farmhand that had lived on the farm almost as long as Marie had been alive, only then does the farm truly kind of come back into its own and come back into its full glory. And I really loved just the way that mirrored the development of Marie and Roscoe's relationship. I don't know if it was intentional, just like I never knew if half of what I was supposed to be trying to get out of books in high school English class was intentional. But I found it was just a really interesting device to use with the plot, just because it was something that was so visual compared to the less concrete status of their relationship. The only thing I'm going to talk about briefly here was like the parole meetings. I've never been to parole meetings, but they always seemed very strict. Like, I always felt like the prisoners going in would have more information. Like, when Roscoe was going into these, every time we heard about it, it always seemed like he didn't really know what he was supposed to be getting out of his stay in jail, and the parole board was like, oh, he's not rehabilitating the way we want, we can't give him parole. And I just feel like there was a really big disconnect between the wants and needs of the prisoners and what was expected of them by the parole board. Again, I really don't know how it works, especially in Alabama in the 1920s, but it was just something that kind of weirded me out a little bit that I wanted to talk about. But otherwise, I don't really have anything. Mostly it was the imagery and of the farmhouse compared to Marie and Roscoe's marriage. So I really don't have anything else to talk about. And with that, I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.